Hey everyone, thanks so much for joining us today. We have an incredible opportunity to spend the afternoon with Dr. John Kelly and Dr. Eric Rossen as Dr. Rossen presents and discusses the topic of compassion in trauma-informed schools and what we can do as educators to make sure that we are supporting our students and our staff during this unprecedented time. I'm going to spend a couple minutes introducing Dr. John Kelly, and then he'll have the great pleasure of introducing his good friend, Dr. Eric Rossen. I did share this on social media earlier today, and just have to gush for just a second. I'm so excited to be the ILUMA representative that gets to be on this webinar with Dr. Rossen and Dr. Kelly, and I know that you all join me when you welcome both of them, and we're so grateful for their time this afternoon. Dr. John Kelly is the past president of the National Association of School Psychologists. He is a very experienced school psychologist and spent, Dr. Kelly, is it 35 years with the Colmac public schools?
That is correct. Yes, 35 years. Still going strong.
That is amazing. Wow, what a lucky school district to have you serving those students. We've been fortunate to have a relationship with Dr. Kelly and learn a lot from him. He spent time with us during our Illumination Summit this September, and we're really grateful that he's partnered with us for this mental health focused webinar series. And we're extremely grateful to have Dr. Rossen here as well. So I'll turn it over to Dr. Kelly to introduce Dr. Rossen.
Sure. Thank you, Jamie. Really appreciate not only your support, but really the support of ILUMA and moving forward in this direction. And certainly working with not only school psychologists, but our partners in school social work, school counselors, all the related services, speech language pathologists, the administrators, so on and so forth. So we're just thrilled to be able to move in this direction and work with you on that. I don't want to take up too much time, but I do want to be able to introduce, yes, my good friend, Eric Rossen. Dr. Rossen is a nationally certified school psychologist. He is an expert, a true expert in the field of trauma-informed, compassionate care within the schools. And I have attended and learned from Eric in numerous occasions and use his work in my work in the school district. So without further ado, let me turn it over to Dr. Eric Rossen for what I'm sure will be an eventful next hour. We do hope to take some questions towards the end. Jamie will be monitoring the chat box. If you want to post any questions in the chat, we will be trying to address some of those towards the end. So let me turn it over to Dr. Eric Rossen.
Great. Well, thank you, Jamie and John. Such a pleasure. Love working with ILUMA. Love working with both Jamie and John as well. So I want to just jump right into it. My goal this morning is to really introduce and make sure we have a shared understanding about what we mean by trauma, talk about some of the aspects of when we're thinking and talking about trauma, that we're thinking about some of the unique impacts. So I'll talk a little bit about cultural impact. And then I want to get into these 8 practices of compassionate trauma-informed schools, which really anyone can provide and doesn't necessarily require an advanced degree or a mental health degree. But I want to start off with these kind of warm-up questions. So if you want to put your answer in the chat to any of these, I'd love to hear them. Which Apollo mission did astronauts first see the Great Wall of China with the naked eye from space? In what year did English become the official language of America? Or what color enrages bulls? Okay, so I see Chris Van Houten. Hey, Chris, saying 17. A lot of people saying red. Apollo 13. Thank you for those participating for sure. And I want to start off by saying, if you've actually seen some of my presentations before, I apologize ahead of time if you hear some of the same stories and some of the same information. Okay, So here are the answers to these questions. You can't see the Great Wall of China with your naked eye from space. I actually didn't. I learned that just within the last year. So anyone who's thrown out Apollo numbers, I'm with you. It's all good. Don't feel bad. In what year did English become the official language of America? There is no official language of America. So I see like Olga got that right. A few other people got that right. And what color enrages bulls? Bulls are colorblind. So it isn't the color of the cape that bothers them. It's the movement of the fabric. And that's what incites bulls to charge. And why am I doing this as a warm-up? It's because sometimes we get in these places where we have some knowledge, or we think we have some knowledge, and we start to accept that as fact. And I think in many cases, I've seen that be the case with trauma. I've seen many people talk about trauma, and they're using the terminology slightly incorrectly because of information that's been shared and passed in folklore, social discussions, or whatever that might be. And so I will be talking briefly about defining trauma because it is important that we, as professionals working with children and families and in schools, are using the terminology consistently and accurately. Whoops. And then lastly, this slide, I love this quote. If you've seen one school, you've seen one school. All right. So actually, I did not mean to include those slides, so I'm skipping over them. So just in the interest of time. So defining trauma. So what do we mean by trauma? I will say there are multiple definitions that exist out there. One that I particularly like is the one from SAMHSA, and they kind of have this statement, and I always unpack it in these kind of three buckets. One, it is an event or an experience. So trauma does not necessarily need to result from some objectively catastrophic event that someone experiences. It could be something that is occurring on an ongoing basis, could be from low-grade chronic stress that's occurring. And so trauma is not from a tornado that rips your house in half, or some serious loss, or significant experience of abuse. So again, it could be an experience that occurs over a long period of time. And I will say even the DSM-5 updated their definitions of trauma, which can result even from secondhand experience. So like seeing something on the news can actually be a source of trauma clinically. So again, it is a broad, has a broad impetus. But the second piece is what's most important. It's what an individual interprets or perceives as threatening or harmful to their well-being, right? Trauma is subjective. It is not up to the adults to determine what is traumatic for kids, right? It is up to the kids to determine what is traumatic to them and what is stressful to them. And so we need to be careful not to apply our own lens of what should or shouldn't be stressful or traumatic. Many times we fall in this camp, right? Oh, this was traumatic, right? All our kids are probably going to be traumatized by this. Or the false negative of saying, that shouldn't be too stressful for kids. No, not our job to make that determination, okay? And the third piece is it has to cause some kind of functional impairment. Whoops. So this is my daughter. This is the same person. She's now 11, but this was her when she was like 2, and probably everything from like birth to like 4, right? This was a face we saw quite a bit of. And we laugh about it to this day, good, thankfully. But she is someone who, and I reflect a lot as a parent, and I have 2 daughters, how often things would happen. And it was so easy for me as an adult, and some might say even a rationally thinking adult at times, that when something small would happen, my response, and again, I'm saying it now, something small, that's my perception. That is no big deal, right? Oh, we'll get you another toy. We'll find whatever, it's just a carrot, right? That just fell on the floor, whatever. But we all have been in the situation, either giving that advice, giving that input, or receiving it. It's not helpful, right? Because it doesn't matter whether we think it is stressful or not, whether it should be stressful or not. It is up to that person. It is our job to be responsive to them. So that is one thing that I really hope you take away from today. Trauma is subjective. It is not defined by you as the adult watching from the sideline. So thinking about understanding trauma from a neurological perspective, and this oversimplifies very complex neurological processes and physiological processes, but I think it's a worthwhile simplification. So if we think about this road as the way we process information, right? What happens when we undergo a stress response? Well, we have significant and extreme physiological changes that occur, right? Adrenaline and cortisol, these hormones are flowing through our bloodstream, our heart rate increases, the large muscles of our bodies dilate, the blood vessels in those large muscles dilate, right? So that's our gross motor stuff. We can punch harder, run faster, or have more acute senses. And the vessels in our organs and smaller muscles are constricting, right? So we lose a lot of our fine motor control. And our prefrontal cortex receives a lot less blood flow as well, right? And everyone knows that's for reasoning, and that's responsible for planning and working memory and inhibition and impulse control. So many say that when we undergo acute stress, we become fast, strong, and dumb. And that is not just for kids, right? That's for adults. There's research on that impact on surgeons, or impacting eyewitness testimony, or even the quality of a professional singer's voice. So stress creates these physiological changes that are often automatic. That's what we often just call a stress response. Now, when the stress response gets triggered over and over, this is when we have a big problem, right? Chronic stress. And when that stress response gets activated over and over, it not only becomes the main pathway by which we interpret or perceive the events that are occurring around us, but it becomes it means that each time that gets more triggered, it's more likely to cause a stress response in the future. And that stress response wreaks crazy havoc on a kid's developmental trajectory. Even things like a stress response, there's research that's found that a stress response triggers an immune response, right? So again, think about it. You feel like you're being attacked and your body is releasing hormones to get your immune system going. They found that repeated activation of a stress response can increase your risk of autoimmune disorders in adulthood. So again, I mean, we're learning more and more about just all the negative impacts of ongoing repeated activation of that stress response. No bueno. All right. Now, what do we know about stress? Generally speaking, we know it's more prevalent than most think, or than people previously thought. A lot of research shows that when you ask parents and you ask or caregivers in their children about the kids' stress levels, the adults tend to underestimate how stressed kids are, generally speaking. The good news, however, is that most recover adaptively, though it's not always in a straight line, right? So there's lots of different trajectories following stress, right? So that's the other thing to remember, that stress is not like, well, you recover or you don't. And there's research to show that there's at least 10 different trajectories that are zigzagging or up and down or gradual, and they can take 20 years to see that trajectory come to completion. Stress has multiple sources, right? And so it's not always from the home, it's not always, or it can be from the environment, could be from the school setting, could be from your social groups. Stress has a dose response effect. This is the idea that if we think about stress in doses, that the more doses of stress you receive, the higher your risk of a negative outcome and a negative stress response, to the point where quantity may be more predictive of negative outcomes than the quality or intensity of a particular stressor. And then lastly, and this one is so critical, stress can be contagious, right? There was a recent study, and youth can experience secondary traumatic stress when their close friends or family experience stress. So again, we can't just look on the surface about, we know some catastrophic thing happened, and if we don't know about it, then they're probably fine, or we should not assume, or it's easy to assume that stress is not impacting them in any way, because if their family is stressed or their friends are stressed, they can experience clinical symptoms of traumatic stress. All right, so myth versus fact. You can put your answer in the chat box with an M or an F. If you've heard these before, you can feel free to answer if you'd like. All right, so myth or fact. Exposure to adversity invariably leads to negative outcomes. Is that a myth or a fact? All right, Melissa, Barry. Hey, Barry. 2 people say myth, 3, Victoria. Okay, good. I'm liking what I'm seeing. All right, we're all on the same page. That is a myth. Not only is it not a sure thing that stress leads to trauma, only a minority, a small number of kids experiencing adversity will experience trauma. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't pay attention to it. What it means is that there are probably many things in place that enable those students to recover adaptively and appropriately. But that, again, we should be thinking about how we're using the word trauma carefully. Second one, myth or fact. Poverty and social disadvantage account for a lot of variance in outcomes following adversity. Okay, so Melissa said 2 is definitely a myth. Melissa, I'm sorry to say, it's a fact. So a lot of people are saying fact. It is a fact. Poverty and social disadvantage account for a lot of variance in those outcomes following adversity. So when you factor that piece in, that can dictate or at least account for some of the differences in outcomes. Doesn't account for all of it though. But again, knowing about a history of adversity, this just drives home that same point, broken record. Knowing about history of adversity alone does not create a predictable outcome, right? We have to think about it as indicators of risk. But knowing about stress is not the same thing as saying they're traumatized or there is trauma or they have a trauma, right? Stop saying that unless you know the outcomes at the individual level. Lastly, myth or fact, childhood adversity, ACEs, trauma are synonymous. All right, Victoria. Okay, we're back on speaking terms. We're good. So yes, myth, ACEs and trauma are not the same thing. Okay, so again, I always share these similar terms. They invoke similar feelings, but again, they are slightly different. They all kind of mean different things. And I said this before, thinking about resilience too. We should avoid this false dichotomy of resilient versus not resilient, right? Resilience is not a simple construct. It's often oversimplified in how we talk about it, but it represents not a thing you are, but it is a process, right? It's a process where you overcome and you adapt to adversity or the obstacles in one's life. And research suggests that, it's not a trait, right? It's a series of behaviors and thoughts and actions. And they promote adaptability and they can be nurtured and they can be taught to anyone. So, again, I think we need to realize that there are active ingredients to promote resilient and adaptive recovery versus saying, well, someone is resilient or they're not. An interesting way that I've heard it even spoken about sometimes is sometimes there's, you see people that have resistance, right? Almost an immunity, right? And these are people that might have a stable trajectory, whereas resilience refers to an adaptability where you kind of absorb stressful events and then you activate your various resources as part of your recovery process, right? So like a rubber tube can be bent, but it can snap back in place. And then, of course, there are other trajectories beyond this. But I don't want us to oversimplify outcomes or potential outcomes as well. All right. So I always think it's important to talk about cultural influences on trauma, and then I'll get to our 8 practices. So again, if you've heard some of these before, I do apologize, but I like reruns, so hopefully you do too. So imagine you've invited everyone to your house for a dinner party, where dinner parties are still happening. Remember dinner parties? Yeah, me too. All right, so the invitation says 5 p.m. Monica arrives at 5, Angela arrives at 5:30, Samantha arrives at 6:30. Curious, put in the chat box, who do you think arrived at the right time? Come on, Barry, you're giving away all my you're giving away my outcome points here. But yes, you are right. Depends, Angela, Monica, the host. Yeah, the host did arrive at the right time. Okay. So nobody here is saying Samantha so far. I am seeing that. And I always share that I did go to this one community and do this exercise. The first time I did this exercise, and it was in Miami. And it was with a largely Latinx community. Nobody said Monica. In fact, they were laughing. When I first did it, they were laughing. And then when I spoke to someone, they're like, the idea of someone showing up right at 5 was laughable, right? That would be considered rude. Whereas for me, right, like if someone showed up at 6:30, I'd probably see that as being rude. And the truth is, I'd be not only using my own lens to interpret other people's behavior on what's appropriate, but you know, and that would be wildly unfair. But I'd also be assuming some level of intent to disrespect me, right? Or that they were unthoughtful, which would be totally wrong because, as someone said, as Barry said right from the get-go, right? This is just one small example about how our culture can impact how we see the world around us, how we interpret other people's behavior, how we interpret intent of others. So here's another example. And again, this is based on a true story. I pulled the image off of Google Images. So this isn't a picture of that actual day. We didn't have time to take pictures, but in truth, now, if I saw this, or if I was doing training with graduate students, most people would engage an administrator, either contact the parents, people might actually call Child Protective Services. However, what ended up happening in this case was that this was the outcome of a folk medicine, a Southeast Asian folk medicine called coining or gaoya, where you take oils and rub it on the end of a coin and you rub it on the skin with the intent of drawing blood away from the heart, but it does cause bruising. And again, this is a case where if we're not thinking about the context, understanding that the lens that I am using, where this is not something I would do in my own home, and it would probably be surprising and potentially damaging to my own children because it lacked that context as being a medicinal exercise, would potentially create more problems. That doesn't mean the kid wasn't stressed, but we need to be careful about how we're using our own lens to interpret the behaviors of others and projecting what we think others should feel as an outcome of what they've experienced. Social culture and time is changing, right? So I show these pictures, these ones on the left, right? I always remember sitting in the front seat. Remember, I always talk about it, that front seat was just like a bench. And there wasn't like this console with all the stuff. It's just a bench with like, you know, foam sticking out. Well, you know, my car was. If a dad pulled up to school with the kid sitting in his lap like that, they'd probably get in trouble, right? This would be considered potentially neglectful behavior. In the 70s, maybe not. And now, you know, kids are strapped in at the local police station or fire station with these seats that weigh like 50 pounds, right? And like they're safe enough to like break the sound barrier. They're enormous and they're bulky. And that is a change over time. In the 70s, that wasn't a big deal. Similar to smoking in the car. Now people are relegated to smoke outside. They can't even smoke inside in many places, at least where I live. This is another thing to think about, right? Are you being disrespected or do you feel disrespected, right? Is there a difference between being disrespected and feeling disrespected? Yup. Because many times this idea that, and I've seen this, you know, what's the number one reason that kids have disciplinary issues in school, right? Disrespect, insubordination. And many times we have to realize that kids are not necessarily intentionally being disrespectful, but the teacher is feeling disrespected because they have an expectation based on their own cultural background, right? How they grew up, right? I remember I went to a school and kids were expected to say sir or ma'am. I never grew up saying that. It felt weird to me and uncomfortable. And if I had to transfer to that school, I'd be in the principal's office all the time because it just wasn't automatic for me because I wasn't raised that way. And that doesn't mean it was wrong or right. It's just different. So we need to be careful about avoiding applying our own lens of what is normal, right? And that we have to apply this cultural humility when we're working with students, when we're thinking about their experiences, whether they're stressful, whether they may lead to trauma, right? This idea of cultural humility, where we're openly approaching others with a non-judgmental curiosity about who they are, their cultural identity, and that realizing that there are limitations to our ability to fully understand someone else's life experiences and acknowledging that, and that's okay, and just having a genuine curiosity and interest in a student's life narrative, right? And so I challenge you to think about what your blind spots might be, right? I can say I worked in a district, I grew up as a kind of a secular Jew in Long Island, and I worked in a district where the church was a major part of the community. And I struggled severely with being able to identify with that and connecting with students and understanding what a driver that was for how people spoke and recovered. And it was something, I really needed to learn, but I also needed to acknowledge that, like, just because I saw things differently doesn't mean that I was right. I was just different. So again, I think many times we're all been in places where, like, well, I grew up and this happened to me and I was fine, right? Or this, this happened to me and this is how our kids should go. Like, maybe not. Like, just because it happened to us doesn't mean it's the best for everyone else. So, that's all right. All right. I want to quickly define trauma-informed as well, very quickly. Trauma-informed, this is SAMHSA's definition. I'm not going to read it to you. Basically, is these 4 R's: realize, recognize, respond, and avoid re-traumatization. This is basically about being aware of it. We've been in these first 2 bullets for a while. Awareness of the impact and the signs and realizing and recognizing it. We're in the place now where we need to be responsive and we need to resist or prevent re-traumatizing people, including in the school. But trauma-informed largely is a perspective change, right? It's how you think. It's a framework for how we interact with students and families, how we approach the students and families we work with. How do we make kids feel safe and loved and capable and likable, and creating protected spaces to foster resilient recovery and adaptive growth, allowing kids to shift their focus from survival to recovery and focusing on normative developmental tasks, right, and developmental competencies rather than focusing on survival. Do want to also reflect and reinforce that trauma-informed approaches and frameworks is a tier 1 school-wide thing, right? This is not a let's provide individualized therapy to every kid we know has a trauma history, okay? That has a small part in it, but this is actually, this is from a consensus process, and you can see 6 of these 8 elements are tier 1. And so again, it is a tier 1 effort. And so I think this quote really captures that. When a flower doesn't bloom, you fix the environment in which it grows, not the flower. All right, so let's get into these 8 practices of compassionate trauma-informed schools. Number 1, empower, never disempower, right? So we want to improve students' sense of control and autonomy, right? So the need for control and autonomy increases as life becomes more unpredictable, right? Increasing predictability is so critical. Increasing sense of control I talked about my my foibles as a parent. Again, I went through it with my toddler, right? Where, do you want to put your shoes on? And they're like, no. And I'm like, well, shoot, I'm in this situation now. We're in a power struggle. They wanted to exercise some control over what they were doing, and I certainly did as well. And we were in a power struggle. Over time, I learned, like, you ask different questions, you give them opportunities to feel control. Which shoes do you want to put on? Do you want to put them on the car? Do you want to put them on in here, right? Do you want to wear your pink sparkly ones or your black boots? Whatever. But again, many times when we are, if we're working with, I think this is true for all kids, but students with trauma histories have a greater need for sense of empowerment. And when we can provide that, the more we can provide it, the less likely we are to get into power struggles. So I often share this, which is based on a real life story. Mike, a 10th grader, walked into Miss Wilson's classroom wearing a hat. She asked him to take it off. He said no. She asked with more firmness. The hat remained. She said, well, she again demanded that he take it off. And she was already thinking, like, I'm going to show this disrespectful kid he isn't messing with me in my class, right? And we can all probably relate to it or empathize with her, right? Because now she's in this predicament, right? It's in front of the whole class. It's a public power struggle. Neither of them are going to win, because if he ends up taking the hat off, right, the relationship is damaged. He's probably dysregulated. He wanted it on for some reason or another. He lost that power struggle, or she loses the power struggle. He keeps it on. She's like, I really don't want to send him to the principal, whatever. And then suddenly, she loses any sense of authority, right? All the kids know that they can just do whatever they want, walk all over her. Well, in truth, what happened in this case is the teacher thought, well, why is this so important to Mike? She told the class to do some independent work. She pulled Mike aside. She learned that he was temporarily in foster care, and his hat was the only connection he had to his mother at the moment. And so she gave him options, right? She said, you can take the hat and put it in your locker. You can leave it with me. I could put it in a drawer. You can put it in your bag, or you can choose to leave it on. But if you choose to leave it on, I will have to write you up and mention this. But you can stay in the class either way. And he ended up going to his locker. But what she did was she empowered him, and she took away the power struggle. This idea that we're empowering and giving a sense of control. Number 2, unconditional positive regard. So important. This is like one of your Psych 101 concepts. If you ever took Psych 101, this is this idea of that we hold our students in high regard, meaning that we want them to do well. We have their best interests in mind. And there's a no strings attached arrangement there. There is nothing that they can do. It is unconditional. There are no conditions in which we suddenly give up on students or we don't want what's best for them. That doesn't mean we don't get annoyed with them. That doesn't mean we don't react because we're humans. But it means that afterwards, sometimes if the dust settles or we are dysregulated as adults, we remain holding students in a positive and a high regard. And this is so huge for trust and developing trust. You're removing an enormous barrier to self-regulation and eventual learning. And I think, among the many reasons why zero tolerance is bad and the outcomes are horrible, zero tolerance is the ultimate violation of unconditional positive regard. Because basically it is saying that your participation in the school community, us welcoming you here is conditional. It's conditional on anything you do on any given day. Now, certainly, if you bring a gun to school, if you break the law, right, and there are different things to consider there. But for the most part, we know zero tolerance is problematic, and this is one of the reasons why. And I always use this mantra under this idea of unconditional positive regard. take things personally as adults, right? It's not about me. It affects me, but it's not about me. It affects me, but it's not about me. And if you can remember this and build it in, even when you're in the heated moment and the student says something to you or a caregiver says something to you. And I've shared the story of one of my first IEP meetings as a school psychologist. I had suggested that I work with the students, possibly assess them, and the father threatened to fight me in the parking lot. And I would have lost. This was a large dude. And, it was only years later when I realized that didn't have anything to do with me. He was stressed. He was potentially embarrassed, right? Or ashamed or scared. And it was his way of exercising control in a situation where he felt overwhelmed and frustrated. Now, certainly it wasn't the right way to do it, but nevertheless, I think if someone had told me this early on, it would have helped me immensely. And I often share this with the teachers I worked with, right? Never in the heat of a moment, of course, but afterwards, like, okay, next time this happens, like, just remember, like, this has nothing to do with you. Like even though the student told you to, go F off, like, it didn't have anything to do with you. In fact, you're a safe person where they can say that and they're fairly certain that they'll still be okay. All right, number 3, maintain high expectations. Compassion does not translate to lower expectations, right? Flexibility can still allow for high expectations. Lower expectations communicate something very bad, right? Communicates that you think less of the person, even though it's often coming from the right place. And we know from all this research, and I love this rat study, and it's like from like the 60s, but hey, lots of good stuff comes from the 60s, where they gave 2 sets of rats that were randomly assigned to, people to have a standardized process for training them to go through the maze. And they told one group, like, you have the smart rats, another group, you have the stupid rats. You have you have this period of time, standardized process, every rat was supposed to have the same thing. And guess what? The smart rats made it through the maze faster. But there are no smart rats or stupid rats, right? They were all just rats. And just planting the idea that some were smart and some were stupid changed the outcome. So expectations do matter, even if they're not spoken about regularly. So I've shared this many times. If you've heard me speak on this before, this is one of my favorite projects when I was a school psychologist in middle school. We created a dispositional swear jar. Anytime somebody used a term that was dispositional, like they're lazy, they're unmotivated, they're oppositional, you had to put money in there. And we had a list that if any time said any of those words, and then we would add words along the way. And once a month, we would take that money and fund happy hour with it. And it was great. I mean, the only, the good news and the bad news is that after a while, we didn't have much money to work with because we actually stopped doing that, because we realized that using dispositional phrases and assigning a disposition to a child changes our expectations of those children, even if they don't hear it, because it changes our views and it impacts how we react around them. So this is not a chart I created, but it's one I love. And you can use all of these on the left as like dispositional qualities, right? And how we can modify that, and how we can think differently about that and change our expectations. Similarly, with those expectations, I have a colleague who is a school psychologist, and she used to work with students, and she would have them give a compliment. And that was the game. Give a compliment to someone else. The compliment shouldn't be superficial. And she said it was extremely powerful. She had multiple students that would cry And they would say, I didn't know anyone ever thought of me this way. I didn't know anyone ever saw me this way before. And not only that, it was a good educational opportunity because many people stink at giving compliments and many people stink at receiving them. So, that changed the trajectory for many of those students. That's saying, I never knew anyone thought I could do that. And I never knew anyone saw me as smart or articulate or thoughtful or caring or a good friend or whatever that compliment might be. Then, of course, don't forget the dead man's rule for goal setting. Can a dead man achieve the goal? If we're doing things like in our IP goals or just generally our goals where it's don't protest, don't stop raising your hand, stop interrupting, stop getting up. If a dead man can achieve the goals you're setting, the expectations are too low. So again, we want to ask not what is wrong with you, but what is strong with you. And I share this link here, this free character strength survey. It's a great survey where no matter what, you get strengths of the individual. And sometimes just seeing their strengths laid out can be a really powerful experience, both for us as adults working with that student and the student themselves. And we can talk through it and how to accentuate that, build on their strengths, maintain those high expectations. All right, checking assumptions, observing and listening. So I love this particular Instagram post because it highlights the idea how often we make assumptions as educators. So this is a teacher who basically was saying that today was rough. It was after a long weekend. One of the students in her class was off task. I given her instructions, reminded and repeat and repeat and repeat. Normally it would have been all spice for me in reaction, but for whatever reason, instead, I asked him to write down 3 things that were on his mind from the weekend, keeping him from working. He wrote, and you can see, Mom got locked up, Dad got locked up, Grandma don't want me. And so she wrote back, I love you. I'm grateful and lucky to be your teacher. You are amazing and so smart and a great dude. And then she reflects afterwards, talking about how just asking the right questions and avoiding assumptions, that he was just willfully disobedient in trying to get under her skin. Instead, she observed, she asked questions, and she listened. So we want to confront our own assumptions. I started using lists like these in all of our pre-team meetings for students. We would always go through these assumptions. The student is doing something. Okay, does the student know what they're doing is wrong? Are we assuming that? Do we know that? How do we know that? How do we test that? Do they possess the skills to do it differently or do what we're asking them to do? Do they trust us, right? We would confront these assumptions sometimes. And it was a good way to structure our conversation. Feel free to grab these and use these yourselves and see how it works. I have a feeling that you'll find that it leads to very interesting conversation. And when we're challenging ourselves to say, well, yeah, we are saying that, but we are making assumptions, and maybe we should go back and look at that. And sometimes we make assumptions, but they're just seeking attention, right? Well, maybe we all have heard the phrase, attention seeking is, forgetting the word, but I'll move on, it will come to me. Attention-seeking behavior is normal. It's developmentally appropriate. We need to be worried when kids don't want attention. So we should not over-pathologize attention-seeking. And I think many times our assumptions are that attention-seeking is, a problematic behavior. That's it, Chris. Thank you. Connection-seeking. Man, read my mind. I'm so glad you're here. So this is just a funny little anecdote on our assumptions. Little boy says, where does poo come from? Father says, well, son, poo passes down the esophagus by the peristalsis and enters the stomach, where digestive enzymes induce a probiotic reaction in the alimentary canal. This contracts the protein before waste enters the colon. Water is absorbed, whereupon it enters the rectum, finally to emerge as poo. The little boy says, well, wow, where does Tigger come from? I love that one. All right, prioritize relationships. Relationships are a prerequisite to learning. Improving and maintaining relationships remains such a critical element of a trauma-informed approach. Remains such a critical element of generally all of our work in education. I know Dr. John Kelly would absolutely agree with me on that one. This is a quote I really like. Resilience requires relationships, not rugged individualism. That's why I have issues with grit. This idea that we shouldn't just say, well, students need to be able to pull themselves up by the bootstrap, you need to be tough. But instead, this idea that we need to foster relationships, we need to create an environment that is nurturing and they have other people that they can connect with. In fact, recently I was reading an interesting article. This is a tangent, I know I'm running low on time, but it was this whole idea about avoiding the savior mentality when you're working with traumatized students. If a student says to you, you're the only one I can talk to about this, red flag. It's not a compliment, right? It is a problem. It is concerning because it means that they don't have the ability to develop and maintain relationships with others. It is our job to make sure that they can do that and other people are attuned to helping them do that. All right. This is a relationship mapping activity. The link is there. This Ask Me Anything with relationships, I think is very funny. Just Joe Brummer, who does a lot of restorative practice work, he told me that, you know, many times as adults, we know a lot about students, but they don't know a lot about us. And so he would have and he says, when one person knows a lot about another, but not the other way around, that's called stalking. So he has his teachers do this Ask Me Anything exercise where students can ask them anything. They can choose not to answer certain questions, right? Like, how much do you make, right? But anytime I've heard of teachers actually doing this, after I talk about it, they said it was awesome and a lot of fun. Okay, so pain shared is half, joy shared is doubled. All right, I'm going to fly through these so we have time for questions. I know we started a little late, and so we're kind of up against the wire. Number 6, focusing on staff well-being. I draw a difference between staff well-being and staff self-care. I've participated in many conversations on self-care. I personally, like, mindfulness and yoga are not like great for me. Many times that is a recommendation, but I think more importantly, especially those of us that are working in schools, we need to take advantage of the fact that we're part of an organization that can create an environment of support. So one example that's always, I think, illustrates this is the idea of emails, right? You can go to a self-care webinar and have someone say, well, you need to set boundaries around your email checking. But if the rest of your organization is sending and responding to emails on the weekend, that's going to be stressful for you to do that. So instead, if you as an organization and your supervisor says, don't email on the weekends unless it makes you feel good. If you email me, I'm not responding. If you email someone else on our staff, don't expect a response. That will enable you to exercise some of those self-care skills. So I think self-care is nested under the idea of well-being, staff well-being. And then I think we need to think about that more holistically. Zipping through these, I'm sorry, these are some tools for you. You can always email me after. Number 7, and we're almost done here so I can get to the questions. Consistency and predictability, right? So knowing what to expect consistently enables us to function, and that is especially true for kids with trauma histories. Remember this, predictability is a potent mood stabilizer and stress management tool. And anytime, think about the times in your life where you rely on some routine or predictable thing, right? Whether it's your commute to work and then like suddenly this road is closed and you're like, what the, right? It is a potent mood stabilizer. And research found during COVID, right, that children fared better when they had predictable and consistent routines. not just schedules, but routines at home. So it's important to continually communicate these routines and ensure that kids know what to expect. And it goes beyond the day-to-day, right? An example I've often given is like a support strategy, not an intervention, but like a kid who's visiting an incarcerated parent for the first time. Someone sat with that student and helped them know what to expect to make that experience predictable when they visited them for the first time, right? What are they going to be wearing? What should you wear? Will you hug them? Will there be a guard nearby? Can you bring something for them? Can you bring something back? Do I get to hug and kiss them? How long do I stay? You know, what snacks can I bring? What does it look like from the outside? Or is there barbed wire? Predictability and consistency. And then lastly, number 8, last but not least, providing guided opportunities to help others. So feeling that impacts students, particularly traumatized students a lot, is helplessness. And helping others can really mitigate that. And there's been research that's found that school engagement has emerged in multiple studies as a significant factor in promoting positive adjustment following stress and adversity. All right. This is just a little resource folder. If you want to, I don't know if you want to drop in the chat box, there's just some articles or tools in there. It's a Google Drive I've had for years, and I just leave it up, share it with anyone you want. I occasionally drop new things in there I haven't in a little while. Okay. Ran a little late, but questions, comments, insults. Let's go.
Thanks, Dr. Rossen. And I'll drop the link in the chat in just a second. Before we start with questions, we have a number of great questions from the audience. Dr. Kelly, I didn't know if there was any, if you had any questions or any feedback you want to share before we start with the audience questions.
Let's jump right into it. I've been watching the chat. I appreciate everyone's involvement. Some great questions in there. I know Eric will be able to address some of it. I'd be happy to jump in and add my own 2 cents if it's appropriate. So yeah, let's go right to the chat questions.
All right. So a question from Barry. He wanted to know if you could talk about addressing trauma in the context of the COVID pandemic and its impact on children.
So this is one where I think so I will say, I don't really know. I don't think we fully know. I do think that we need to remember and go back to the original part about how are we defining trauma? Are we defining it as our expectation for an outcome, or are we using the subjective experience of the individual to define trauma? And are we distinguishing trauma from a stressor or a stress response? So if we think about stress on a continuum, trauma is kind of a part of that continuum. But I personally think that we are doing a disservice by making assumptions that every student is traumatized. And I hear this term a lot, collective trauma. And I get that, and I understand it. It conveys something in a very easy and succinct way. But I also think it's dangerous to simply assume that all kids experienced trauma in a very clinical sense. I think we're still learning a lot about the impact. I think we know that a lot of students will experience acute stress responses, but then have an adaptive recovery and not have prolonged trauma from COVID. Others will, and usually it's a result of multiple factors and influences on that.
Yeah, the only thing I'll jump in just real quickly and add to that, because I've heard that question posed to Eric in the past. And Eric, I love the way you make that distinction between trauma and stressors, and really the continuum that we're looking at. And there's no doubt that children, adults, we have all experienced some level of stress as a result of not only the pandemic, but really what's been happening in the world, around us for the last 2 years or so. What I love about Eric's work and what he really presented to us tonight, many of these strategies can really be applied across the board. When he talks about that compassionate care and really how we approach students, while yes, that's a trauma-informed approach, to me, it just makes good sense. It's good educational practice to engage in these strategies with students in general. And so whether we're talking about those students that truly have been traumatized in a clinical sense, or students who are have been exposed to stressors and reacting to those stressors, these strategies are strategies that can be applied across the board.
Absolutely. I mean, I try to remember these as a caregiver, also. So absolutely, John, thank you for adding that.
Absolutely. And this is, I think Victoria makes a great point when, and this is very much in line with what Dr. Rossen, you and Dr. Kelly were just talking about. But if you have any recommendations on how to support, guide, lead your teachers, to getting back to these approaches, and that, Victoria's comment is, I think many people are having a hard time leading with compassion during these times, and I think she makes a great point.
Yeah. Again, I wish I had a very simple answer for you. I think there's a degree of readiness and capacity that is really limited right now. I think number 6, where I talked about staff well-being and staff self-care, I mean, I think that is an underlying prerequisite to care for others, is to feel cared for. And it's kind of why I talk about staff well-being, is this idea is do you feel like, or is our organization, is your school team creating an environment where you feel cared for? Not just are you caring for yourself, but are other people able to care for you, even in a limited way? So yeah, how do you do that? Maybe you don't dump all 8 of these on their lap and say, go. A lot of times it's job embedded, and things you kind of develop over time, right? Like that dispositional swear jar thing, right? It was something that kind of came organically, and we started doing it because expectations came up in a conversation. And so, you try and build these in, or, you say in your next pre-team meeting, you say, you bring those assumption questions I brought and say, I've been thinking more about some of the assumptions we're making, and let's just let this guide our conversation once. Let's see how it goes. So, read the room, to some degree, know who you're working with, take advantage of the good relationships you have, build those alliances, and again, hopefully, if any of these stand out to you, what you're doing can rub off on others.
Yeah,
and would you?
I'm sorry, Jamie. I just, again, love what Eric just shared there. And I just want to reinforce a couple of quick points. Because, Victoria, you're absolutely correct in your question and the assumption behind that question. Our staff are struggling. It's not just the kids. Our staff in the schools are struggling. And while we're hearing a lot about it, on social media, within the media, so on and so forth, part of the distinction that Eric made there between staff well-being and staff self-care is really, really important, because they are, Eric, you're right. They're part of the same thing, but they're two different things. And I've actually seen situations where we go in, we talk about self-care and the need for self-care and the need to engage in self-care. And staff are saying, I get that, but I'm still not okay. This is not okay, what's happening. And so the well-being of our staff and that focus on self-well-being is so important. And speaking to my administrative colleagues, speaking to others that help to support staff, this is such an important piece. We hear a lot about toxic positivity and really the damage that can be done when we don't recognize what the adults are experiencing as part of this process. And so similar to what we talk about kids, we got to take care of kids' emotional well-being before we can get to learning. In many ways, you got to get to the staff well-being before you can get to their ability to truly function at an optimal level within the building. And so that's something I think we need to do a better job at this point in time.
Right, and it is that idea of feeling chronically supported and cared for, right? Versus like pizza in the break room, right? I mean, I love pizza, but that is, I think there are different ideas about what that looks like, too.
I think that's very, very well said. And I'm curious, when we think about the importance of focusing on staff well-being and also not overwhelming staff with, like you said, don't just give all eight strategies and say, here you go, take them and use them. Is there one that if I'm an administrator really looking to make this a priority as we go forward, is there one that you would recommend starting with?
At this point in time, probably this one. I would probably be devoting a great deal of energy to that. And this idea of predictability and consistency to my staff, to our staff. So yeah, I under other conditions, I might be thinking more about things like empowerment and unconditional positive regard, in making sure that we as a staff and how we're working with our students and families, that we're kind of thinking about that and prioritizing that, thinking about that as far as our disciplinary practices and how are we embedding that. But yeah, I think at the moment, and what John's saying, what I think all of us have experienced and heard, yeah, probably this would be a priority. I mean, I'd be curious if others feel differently too. Certainly there's not a right answer.
Dr. Kelly, do you have any thoughts on that one?
No, I'm a big believer in this, and so I would agree 100% with Eric.
All right. I think we've addressed the questions that have been submitted and have enjoyed thoroughly the conversation. I don't know if there are any closing remarks from our experts here. Any other?
I want to take a moment once again to acknowledge ILUMA and supporting this webinar series. It is a series of 5 webinars. This is the second of the 5. I want to thank our expert tonight, Eric Rossen. Yes, he's a good friend, but more importantly, he truly is an expert in this area. And Eric, I appreciate the time, not only that you put in with us tonight, but that you put in general, really helping our schools and the staff within the schools recognize that compassionate care and the value of that within the schools. Next week, we do have Dr. Peter Faustino joining us, talking about autism and mental health. Really an interesting kind of a crossroads, looking at a combination there. Dr. Faustino is a well-known expert within the area of autism. Again, a school psychologist by profession, but involved in many, many ways. We'll hear more about Dr. Faustino next week. So we thank you so much for joining us tonight. We look forward to having you join us next week. If you are viewing this on demand, we thank you for following up and watching. But we hope you watch the entire series. Thank you again and have a great night.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.